So we're just about to get started here at Will Local Journalism Survive the Pandemic? Thanks for joining us, and we're going to give people a couple more minutes to join the webinar. So we'll get started in just about one more minute. Okay, great. Let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to our webinar. This is Will Local Journalism Survive the Pandemic? I'm Charlotte Slayman, the Competition Policy Director here at Public Knowledge, and I'm really excited to introduce to you our illustrious panel who will be discussing this really important question. First, we have Craig Aaron, who's the co-CEO at Free Press, Joaquin Alvarado, Executive Director of Project Accelerate at the Seattle Times, Francis Tony Draper, the CEO and publisher of Afro-American newspapers, our own Lisa McPherson, who's a Senior Policy Fellow here at Public Knowledge. I'm so excited to introduce her to you all, and Steve Waldman, who is the co-founder of Report for America. So thank you so much to our panelists for being here. I'm really excited that we'll get a chance to talk with you about this important topic. The first question, I want to kick it off to Lisa. So Lisa, you've brought this panel together to answer what is a pretty dramatic question. Can local journalism survive the pandemic? What do you think has made this question so important now and so urgently in need of policy solutions?
Thank you. Well, first, I want to acknowledge that threats to local journalism don't make for a completely new story. I suspect all of our panelists and much of our audience would be able to cite the numbers of outlets closing, suspending publication, laying off staff, cutting salaries. But there's also some outlets experimenting with new business models, public support, philanthropy, donations, subscriptions, in the effort to create a new future for the industry. What makes it urgent, though, is that COVID-19 has drastically accelerated the timeline on which we need to create that new future. One estimate put it as, we've moved forward 3 to 5 years or more in the need to create new ways to sustain local journalism. The pandemic has introduced this crazy paradox. People are turning to their local journalism outlets more than ever before for reliable, deeply local information about how the virus is impacting their communities. And they're also using it to counter the misinformation that they're seeing all over the internet and in social media. But at the same time, shelter-in-place orders and shuttering of local businesses have cratered local advertising, which was one of the last sort of protected sources of revenue for many local journalism outlets. Words like extinction and annihilation are now routinely being used to describe the state of local journalism today. So we now need to accelerate solutions. And what I'm really interested in learning more about is how can we use what we're learning from the pandemic and the way people are counting on local journalism to create policy solutions that can be at best bridges and at worst experiments toward new models that can help us create systemic and sustainable solutions to the challenges that local journalism is facing.
Great, thank you, Lisa. So right here at the beginning, I want to start out with defining our terms. We've already been talking about local journalism. So in a lightning round, just 60 seconds, how would you define local journalism? What's in and what's out? Let's start with Craig.
Thanks, and thanks for having me. To me, local journalism is journalism by and for communities, as journalism produced in a particular place that is provided to serve the needs of local residents. And I think this is where we do have to have our focus. It's the journalists who are struggling most right now and who are needed most right now at this crisis moment.
Tony, can you answer this question as well? What's local journalism, very briefly?
Again, thank you for having me. I'm not sure I can add much to what Craig has said. So for local journalism, for me, it's independent or family-owned media companies whose primary focus is to deliver news, balanced, in-depth reporting around our local issues, and in some cases it's hyper-local, which really focused not on everybody in the community perhaps, but just in a particular demographic or a particular geographic area. And so that's how I would define local journalism.
Great. Joaquin, do you have anything to add?
I like all of these first two pieces. I would just, underscore original, verified, sourced, independently edited, some editorial infrastructure. You usually want to see that data-driven for sure, but agree with Craig and Tony for sure.
Great. So studies show that depending on one's age, folks may get the majority of their news and information from the internet, especially social media. What's the role of local journalism, both digital and analog, in the contemporary news and information ecosystem? Does it still matter? What's at stake if local voices are lost? This is a question for Steve.
Well, there was a time, 5 years ago when it was kind of fashionable to say that journalists were going to be replaced by citizen reporters and volunteer bloggers and things like that. And I think at this point, we now realize that it doesn't work that way, but on the other hand, there was also a fashion back then of some of the old line journalists dismissing the role of citizen journalists entirely. And I think at this point, it's become pretty obvious you need both. The role of regular people sharing information can actually often be very positive. We've seen that a lot in COVID, that a lot of the information, for better or worse, is being shared just person to person. But what we're also seeing is that if that's all you have, it just becomes a great big rumor mill, and the ability to distinguish information from misinformation becomes really hard. So I really like to even almost say that the local news crisis is not a local news crisis, it's a local reporting crisis. That there's a shortage of reporters doing original reporting on the ground, as distinguished from, there's plenty of ways of getting news now. There's plenty of ways of sharing news, but it's that reporting-based information that is really drying up.
That's a great point, Steve. Thanks. Lisa, why don't you answer this question as well?
Yeah, I would certainly agree with what Steve said. And I think if we were to sort of ladder it up, I think that's what's lost when local voices are lost is potentially trust. Trust in the quality of the news they're seeing in the way that Steve has described more broadly, trust in the institutions around them, in the other political party, and even in democracy. Survey after survey shows that people trust their local journalistic outlets more than they do national outlets. That's kind of the bedrock for them. And it also shows that when people lose their local news, they also lose a sense of community, a sense of cohesion, and they can sometimes gain corruption and costs in their sort of local governance. So I think there's a lot of larger societal benefits that also go away. And as Steve pointed out, sometimes when they're getting their information from social media, they're getting bad information. And I think quality local journalism can do a lot to counter that.
Great. So I want to make sure that we get to framing the right solutions. So let's talk about some of the things that are leading us to have these difficulties in local news today. What do you think is the role of news consumers, digital platforms, business interests, government, and also the news outlets themselves in creating or compounding the pressures that we're seeing the news face today? Craig?
Well, yeah, you just listed out a lot of different players who are shaping the kind of news we get. And I think, at sort of a macro level, we need to start talking about, is the market we have now capable of providing the news that we need? And I think there's a lot of evidence that says, as currently constructed, it isn't. And yet we've sort of accepted, well, if people can't make a go of it in this way or the other way, well, that's too bad. We're just not going to have nice things like journalism anymore. And I really want to see us flip that on its head, which is to support, private options, public options, really, any kinds of models that can become viable, but that I don't think we should just be reliant simply on like these questions of just simple business model questions. I think we have to have public policy answers that start to say, you know what, no, having reporters on the ground, covering important stories, following the money, going to the meetings, keeping communities informed are too important to just say, oh, sorry, we can't have that anymore. There's too much misinformation. There's too much crucial public health information we need to get out. And that means being open to different kinds of policy solutions, different kinds of supports, different ways to encourage local ownership, support entrepreneurs, but also to really get serious about talking about the kinds of public funding we need to support the public goods that journalism provides.
Absolutely. Great. Steve, can you answer this question as well?
Yeah, I totally agree with Craig, and I have to say reluctantly, not that I don't like agreeing with Craig, but I was a journalist in the commercial sector for most of my career. And I think we all were hoping that there would be commercial models that would develop because it's durable and you don't have to worry about raising money and it's the way it had been. And I think we really have to face facts. It's a hard fact to accept that the business models are not only broken, they're not coming back, at least to support really labor-intensive local reporting, especially accountability reporting. We have to really confront that head on. And when you start to look at that, you realize, first of all, the nonprofit sector has to play a bigger role in local news. We just have to get used to that idea. And that can mean small donors contributing to the public radio station or to a new nonprofit organization. It can mean community foundations, big philanthropy. I'm not saying that that's going to become all there is. I think these innovations on the business model side will help, but they're not going to be enough. So we have to get used to the idea that a healthy local ecosystem is going to be a combination of commercial entities and strong nonprofit entities. That's the way it has to be. And we need to develop both philanthropic impulses around that and public policy that helps encourage that.
Hey, Charlotte, can I just kind of double click on that for a moment?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I think that we have to also distinguish, what has happened in the newspaper industry, right? Which is this era of financialization has strip mined out local reporting resources in a way that's unsustainable. So I coming out of the sort of nonprofit public broadcasting world, there's a lot of lessons learned there over the last 20 years where it doesn't necessarily address issues around diversity. We've had a lot of innovation, but there's still a lot of gaps in nonprofits also. So I do think that mix in local markets is essential. You can run a successful mid-sized, mid-market metro paper if you're not loaded up with debt. So I think that given the impact of COVID, we're losing thousands of jobs as we speak, right? And so having a really high imagination around how big this crater is going to be, I think forces us to really think sort of Apollo 13 style about what are all the tools at our disposal. And that's a mix of policy, market, philanthropy, and ultimately be consumer demand. Public service is there, right? People are depending on their local news outlets of all stripes to kind of deliver information right now. That need's not going to go down. So we have to quickly get a water in terms of being able to sustain the service that's being provided.
Yeah, there were
Thanks,
1,300 counties that didn't have a daily newspaper before COVID. So, and everyone thinks, and I do too, that this is going to accelerate all of the collapses and consolidations that we thought were going to happen over the next 2 or 3 years could now happen over the next 2 or 3 months.
Wow. Yeah. So let's turn to the COVID-19 crisis and how that's impacting news. The World Health Organization has described a massive infodemic that makes it hard for people to find trustworthy sources and reliable guidance when they need it. So how has this changed the situation, and how are local outlets uniquely positioned to address the need for accurate information about the virus? Lisa, why don't you start with this one?
Sure. I think one of the things that the virus has proved to us, something that we all knew intuitively, is that there is a distinct and unduplicated role played by local journalism outlets, particularly for situations like this where the stakes are very high. We're seeing more and more kind of research coming through about almost 60% of Americans are consuming more local news than they did before. That includes younger consumers who haven't necessarily done that in the past. We're seeing evidence that engagement with local stories is reaching the level of national stories on online sources, and in some cases exceeding them. So it has really shown that there is just a necessary role that's played when consumers need to know what's going on in their own background or their own neighborhood. We've also seen that it can play, just as others were saying, play a role in the stuff that they're seeing on the internet, the conspiracy theories and the false information, and it can serve to surround that bad information with good and reliable and local information. I also think it's really interesting that virtually all of the digital platforms have either added or increased new partnerships with organizations that do information analysis and fact checking. So I think they're beginning to see that value as well. And I'm hoping that that's something that continue and that can create value for those organizations.
Great. Joaquin, can you answer this one as well? How are local news outlets uniquely positioned to address the needs of the COVID crisis?
Yeah, I mean, in Seattle, newsroom was very early to it, just given what's been happening here. And the veracity, the thoroughness, the depth of the reporting needs to meet, sort of an infrastructure of community engagement that didn't start with the crisis, right? So best practices in terms of being in relationship to your constituents, your readers, your subscribers, your commuters is pretty essential, right? So if you're starting from scratch, you have to build quickly. But a lot of newsrooms have been learning and applying best practices around community engagement over the last 4 or 5 years. And this is one of the great crossovers between nonprofit land, public broadcasting, and commercial outlets. There has been a great acceleration in terms of really committing to community engagement, so that when you have to stop what you're doing, work remotely, figure out how to put out the product basis, those relationships come through with you. And I think on the misinformation side, it's important to think about how national and local interact. I'm on the board at Consumer Reports, and it has a COVID sort of reporting and resource part that's in front of the paywall, and a lot of local newsrooms are in front of the paywall on this stuff. So if you think about the ecosystem for good information, I'm actually quite proud of American journalism right now for what it's doing and how it's solving the problem of getting to people. So as we think about how to invest, how to change policy, how to get the market react, how to start new things, got a lot to work with, even though it's fast approaching the Yucatan to work with.
Tony, I'm really interested in your perspective. What issues have you seen from the media's coverage of communities of color during the COVID crisis? And how have your members helped to counter misinformation directed towards those communities?
Okay, Charlotte, thank you for that question. Let me say that the issues that impact people of color are not new. And they're not unilateral either. A lot of times when we say people of color, with Black and brown people, we have a tendency to put people into one pot, and it's not. Monolithic communities, or we're not. So having said that, this pandemic has heightened what we already know to be true. The systemic and structural racism is still alive and well. And so it's not surprising that African Americans are disproportionately impacted by COVID-19 because of so many other things that historically have happened. So when you talk about misinformation, there was some misinformation out originally that made people of color think, well, maybe this is not a disease that we would contract. Of course, that's not true. And so that's anecdotal misinformation. It's certainly not misinformation through major news outlets. But when you see coverage that goes one way, people can come to that conclusion, rightfully or wrongfully. So what we try to do, and what we've always done for nearly 128 years, is speak truth to power, make sure the information is there, that is thoroughly researched. So we don't spend a lot of time chasing fake news or chasing, or fact checking someone else's news. We don't have the staff to do that. We spend most of our time making sure that the people who, whether it's online or in print, know so much more about this, and we're talking about COVID now, so much more about what's going on with that and how it might impact our communities. And let me say too, even though we have an African-American focus, our news and information is to educate everyone locally so that we all would, have a better understanding. So yes, that's our focus, but it's certainly not exclusive. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you. So these considerations that the panelists have been talking about are part of the reason that PK has been joining with other organizations and policymakers to support, including financial support for local journalism in the COVID-19 stimulus packages. And I want to ask Craig and then Steve to talk about some of the precedents for government support of journalism that we've seen in the past and what we should learn from that.
Sure, thanks again. Well, I think one thing that people forget is that there is a long history of government support. You can go all the way back to the founding of the country and look at things like postal subsidies, which were given to newspapers so they could be distributed. Certainly for the last 50 years or so, we have built, maybe by international standards, not quite a big enough public infrastructure, but still a significant investment in public media, community media all across the country that the government has supported. And of course, there are many other kinds of government policies that shape what kind of media we get. And so when I hear from journalists, when I hear from others concern about how government policy is going to affect journalism, I mean, it makes a lot of sense because most of those policies have affected journalism in really negative ways. Because they've allowed runaway media consolidation. They've created markets that really undermined the ability of local and independent owners to do their jobs, of reporters to do their jobs. But the problem we've had has been that so many important voices, those people who are actually out there on the front lines, running local newspapers, going out and covering beats and all that, they've been removed from our public policy conversation as often has been the public. So we've had all these decisions. The bosses have always come to Washington to ask for special favors. And the workers have been told, oh, I'm sorry, you're a journalist, you can't be part of this. And that's how we get the kinds of policies that we have. So I hope in this crisis moment, maybe something's coming into focus where we can begin to talk about different kinds of interventions, not involved in content, not involved in the government dictating what's covered and what's not, but involved in creating the structures that can actually support the kind of local news that we need.
Yeah, I think, it really is true that there have been public policies all along that affected media, and journalists are by nature, although we're all accused of being liberal, when it comes to media policy, we're mostly libertarian. We really don't want the government involved at all. So the idea of the government supporting or bailing out or anything local news really rubs us the wrong way. But it is true that if journalists and also just citizens say, oh, we don't want to have government policy about the media, it's going to happen anyway. It's just going to be dictated by different people. And that's what's happened in the past, is that, media policy has been dictated by, the chains and TV stations, and very often, what they're advocating for is good, but what I especially think is missing right now is a seat at the table for locally owned and nonprofit media. That to me is those are the folks that are absent having a strong voice or strong enough voice at the public policy table right now. And by the way, having government help doesn't necessarily mean, the government sitting there as a government agency deciding which news outlets get money. In fact, I hope we don't end up with that as a model. I mean, anyone who wants that, I would just say to them, okay, if there was a government agency in charge of supporting local media that decided what place to get grants, I'm pretty sure that Donald Trump would have appointed Jared Kushner to be the Secretary of Local Media. And you keep that in the back of your mind whenever you think about what kind of power you want a government agency to have over local media. So if you look through past history at what kinds of government policies have in fact helped media in a positive way, they tend to be neutral, geared toward nonpartisan journalism. They tend to have sort of formulas instead of a huge amount of discretion from some political person in Washington. And so it is doable. I mean, it just as a couple of examples, of this point, the federal government already spends $1 billion on advertising for military recruitment, census, and now public health ads for COVID. That's already happening. They're already making a policy decision by default, and that policy decision is that all the money should go to national media. Well, that doesn't make any sense. If they're spending it anyway, we could have a huge impact on local media by saying half of that money you're spending anyway should go through local media. And I would add that half of that local media should go to locally owned and nonprofit media. I think that's a really important part. But that's a good example of how you can have a policy change that is positive, affects local communities without, a czar of local media deciding, who gets what. Another example is with the program that I help run, Report for America, which places local journalists out into the community. It's sort of based on like a AmeriCorps Teach for America model. We pay half, the community pays half, and we just, by the way, today is a big day. It's like Christmas for us. We just announced 225 new reporters hitting the field in June, which we're very excited about. 225 is a lot, that's almost quadruple what we did last year. But what the country needs is about 3,000 of those reporters in the field. And that is actually how Teach for America went from a few hundred to being a few thousand and really having a big impact. So AmeriCorps could, as a public policy matter, tweak a few things to allow for journalist corps as another example of the sort of public policy remedy that might help without there being a, Secretary Kushner deciding which media outlet gets help.
So we've got a great question from the audience. Diane Baker asks, how are other countries handling this? Can we use any of them as a model? So I'm wondering if folks are familiar. Yeah, go ahead, Joaquin.
Well, I was just going to say, that there are particularities in every country, right? Like American philanthropy has been at it, even though we could argue that it needs to be doing more or could have done more historically than most other countries where, you've got the BBC. There's an amazing project in the UK called the Bureau Local, which developed out of the Bureau of Investigative Journalism that has gone out of the London base of the Bureau out into the deeply impacted other parts of the UK to try to start with community engagement and then build up to restoring sort of local self-reliance when it comes to figuring out how to deliver local accountability journalism. I think that there are many lessons to learn from there. But the US is also distinctive, I think, in that we often don't have a lot of sort of scalable learning from other places, right? So Canada has acted in a way that's more aggressive than us during the crisis here. And the interventions that exist in Europe and their pressures on public broadcasting, which have been there for quite a number of years, it just gives them a different kind of platform. So I actually would caution a little, like how fast we're going to get to those learnings is a matter of, it has to weigh against how fast we have to act here. And so huge congratulations to Steve and the Report for America team for getting all of this scale and growth in terms of markets thinking about doing community funding. That's given them a framework. But frankly, I think if the rate we're going in another 3 to 6 months, we could lose half the journalists in America out of the profession. And I think if we get to that kind of decay that rapidly, it's going to be really expensive and hard to restore it in time to make a positive impact that many communities will need in terms of responding and recovering from the crisis.
You know, if I might just jump in and say, while agreeing with almost everything Joaquin said, I do think we have to look to some of the other models in Europe and Asia around the kind of public commitment to support media and journalism, and how those places in many ways have weathered this crisis differently because those supports are in place and because they have built this kind of mixed market where you actually see, you know, in many ways benefits for the private sector because there's also this strong public sector. And, you know, you can go around Washington when we can go around Washington and you'll see, you know, foreign bureaus from Germany and Japan and others that are much larger than, you know, the representatives that are even coming in from the States to find out what's going on. And I think we have to hold on to some of those examples and the kind of commitment and the popularity of that commitment in those places as we think about how to make policy and think about the kinds of targeted supports. I think other countries are also thinking, again, outside the United States, very creatively about what are the responsibilities of the platforms. You know, we've got places, the UK Journalists Union just put out a big report talking about, you know, hey, should the platforms be paying taxes in order to support civic needs and local journalism? You've got other countries, I'm not as enamored with the French model, but talking about protecting rights. I think we don't want to do things that are just going to essentially hold up the old media powers that we used to have. But I think the fact that these are open, vibrant public debates that are happening about what is our responsibility, and that start from a point of we need a vibrant, ideologically diverse, racially diverse media in order to have a functioning democracy, that's something we can take away. And that's something we can take away when we're building policies here too, and thinking about how are we targeting our supports to meet the emergency, to meet the disproportionate harms. We started talking about that, how communities of color, Black people in particular, are being affected by the COVID-19 crisis, are being killed, just to be blunt and clear, by the COVID-19 crisis. So when we come in the responses and we have to say, where's this advertising money going to go? Who's being underserved? We have to be looking at the Black community. We have to be looking at publications that provide content in languages other than English that aren't being served in this emergency moment. And I think we can learn from the rest of the world. And frankly, other things that we do well here, scientific research and other programs, in order to start to be able to move quicker toward past some of these debates that I think have really puzzled the journalism space, but that we actually know, hey, wait, they actually figured this out in the rest of the world. Like France has newspaper subsidies, and they have a vibrant political culture. You can do it. They're not deciding what people publish. I think we need to get rid of some of those myths in order to actually make good policy.
And a lot of that.
Craig's point, sorry, Steve, building on Craig's point, several other democratic countries have built support for journalism into their COVID-19 response packages. Australia, for example, has a variety of provisions in theirs about lessening restrictions for the amount of content created in Australia. The United Kingdom has some that includes tax breaks, as well as increasing of advertising through those channels. So even in this emergency, several other countries have model the types of things we might be doing in the short term that may also provide bridges to more long-term solutions.
Steve, it looked like you wanted to get in here too.
Well, just to say that as we think about public policy right now, we want to be designing things that will help us build a better local news system and not just stick our fingers in the dike on, and we do have to stick our fingers in the dike because the dam will blow if we don't, or if I got that metaphor right, I don't know. But so fast, big, messy, blunt instrument steps are gonna have to be part of this. We should, accept that. But we really want to do this in a way that actually creates a better system than what we had, not just repeats or kind of props up some of the dysfunctions that were in the media pre-COVID.
Great. And Tony, I'd like to hear from you about some of the challenges that we've seen in the past. Why has it been so difficult to get government support for journalism as a popular issue? What are some of the barriers?
Well, I think it's always been challenging to get government support for journalism just because of our freedom of the press, how we usually don't like to mix the two. I think someone said that earlier. But we have to look at journalism and journalists not just as purveyors of news, even though we do that, but we're an important part of the community. And I want to be frank about this. I think part of what makes it so difficult now is that there appears to be a constant war between the chief executive of the country and journalists. The daily press conferences or even the COVID-19 press conferences, sometimes, they just turn into something that is not even as professional as it should be, with journalists being under attack. I can imagine being in that room every day and, you just want to ask a question on behalf of the public because we have a responsibility to do that. A responsibility to keep government honest, a responsibility to report accurately, and I think a responsibility to ask the hard questions that everyday Americans want to know. And we want to know how it impacts our local situations. And so even here in Maryland, with our governor becoming a target almost, so you have those kinds. So I think there's always a tension, but I think that now there's an unhealthy tension, and that makes it much more difficult to get the kind of support. But the American people, and especially those who are in local communities, they deserve news that's unfiltered, news that's accurate. And every paper, no, is not liberal, and every paper is not conservative. So papers have their bent, but people have a right, and we are their ambassadors for bringing that news, to them in their homes through whatever medium we're using.
Tony, can I just kind of react really quickly? Because I think you said something so important. Journalists are really of their communities, right? They live in them, they raise their families in them, they care about them. They're a professional, group of folks. And I do think that we have really seen the decaying of trust that's not accidental. It's not the internet platforms, it's the political rhetoric of the age we live in. And we have to deal with that, right? And there has to be a way that I think in local communities, you start to restore that, like block by block, person to person, right? And this crisis demonstrates the same way that communities cannot rely on the federal government to deliver their protective equipment to their healthcare workers. It's like, we got to generate a sense of community sort of pride and ownership over this challenge. Mm-hmm. And I think that actually is a skeleton key to dealing with national policy issues. Like, this isn't somebody else's government, this is our government. We pay the taxes, right? The most profound act of public policy for journalism is the First Amendment of our Constitution, which guarantees the right to free press. So I think higher imagination and greater accountability in communities to understand and recognize that the journalists, just like the healthcare workers, are in fact frontline workers in responding to this crisis. And by doing that, by being serious, it's like, let's get the adults in the room and be as ambitious and creative as we need to be, but we have to be very grounded. Because if we don't get it right, only the federal government can intervene right now at the scale that will save thousands of journalism jobs. Only the federal government. Philanthropy can't do it. Local governments can't do it. Companies can't do it. So if that doesn't happen, and I won't put odds, but if it doesn't happen, then it's going to be left to local communities to solve the problem. Then again, it's going to be block by block.
I agree with you, Joaquin, and I think that's really, really important. And I think it's also important that to note, we know this already, and people who are watching this know, journalism is a profession. It's a profession, so it's a well-respected, or should be a well-respected profession. And so yes, we need the federal government, certainly, and it's not a bailout. We are part of, we are an integral part of the American landscape. And especially when you get to journalists of color, I'm really sensitive, for example, to how an April Ryan, for example, is treated just for asking a question. And so we call that out because we have to. That's the right thing to do. And it's also the right thing to do for policymakers, I believe, to make sure that local independent journalism continues.
Absolutely right.
So we may have an opportunity soon to influence the process of the next stimulus package. And I know that Craig and Steve, you have both put forward specific proposals for how we can help local journalism in the next stimulus package. And I'm wondering if you could tell us about that. Craig, do you want to go first?
Sure, happy to. Yeah, I put out an essay recently in the Columbia Journalism Review describing what I think the sort of building blocks of a journalism stimulus should look like. And it's been a great opportunity to dialogue with a lot of people, including Steve, about what some of the component pieces could be. I think I have sort of some short-term priorities and some longer-term priorities, as we've been talking about here. And I think in response to some of the questions in the chat, there is an immediate emergency need that we've been talking about. So I think the absolute top priority is emergency targeted funding for newsroom workers. I would like to see us devote, $50,000 per newsroom job, or we can debate what that number should be, but in an emergency fund. So if you employ reporters, editors, producers, photographers, you could qualify for a program that would say, yes, here's emergency support right now to keep these people at their desks, to keep them employed, to keep them covering this crucial story. And you could do that. It will cost real money, and we're talking, maybe $1.5 billion. And that sounds like a lot of money, but we just passed a stimulus bill that costs $2 trillion. So that is a tiny percentage. I'll let others do the math, but a fraction of 1% of what was spent in the stimulus bill. So that would be my first step. I think that's got to be a top priority. And the important part here is directed toward newsroom workers. This is not for the bosses. This is not to do stock buybacks. This has to be tied to keeping people in their jobs, and the vast majority of that money, minus unnecessary overhead, needs to go to those workers. Keep them employed, keep them spending money. That's what we should be doing from economic stimulus. I'll be shorter on the other items that I think we should emphasize, and I know Steve will have additions, but I do think we should immediately move to double funding for public media. They got some money in the first CARES Act, but it was a tiny amount. It worked out to about $75,000 a station. I think we should have directed money again toward journalism, news gathering, as well as education. I think that's a big priority. I think those would be two good short-term priorities. I'll let Steve talk about ads and some other things that I know are at the top of his list. Lastly, and this has come up, I really think we not only need to spend in this emergency, but we need to start putting seed money together to support what comes next, because 2 or 3 months of support is going to run out very quickly. And we need more time to start figuring out how we're going to transition this whole market. I would like us to see us put billions in what we call a First Amendment fund. We can talk about exactly where it should go, but the kind of fund that could really be used to hire more new journalists, to support new and emerging projects, and really start to invest. I have a whole bunch of ideas for later in our discussion about how you could fund that over the long term. And yes, I think the platforms in part should pay for it, but I think we have to think about how are we seeding, and I'll borrow from Steve Waldman again, how are we seeding for a deconsolidation strategy? How do we start to think about transitioning toward back to local ownership, get the hedge funds out of this business, support entrepreneurs, support new projects, and support it in the places that need it the most? We have to be thinking about, broad policies where everybody's included. It's not just newspapers, it's not just television stations. We need to be paying attention to digital newsrooms, nonprofit newsrooms, and we need to really be paying attention to those outlets who are serving communities that have not been well served by journalism. We've got to be talking about how Black and brown communities are being served. And I think we have to be prioritizing those outlets, making sure that when we're weighting these formulas, we're getting this money to the places where it hasn't been, filling in those news deserts. And it's going to take a big investment, billions of dollars to do that. But I think it's a very valuable investment in, the health of the country and the health of our democracy.
Well, I actually agree with Craig that the first priority has to be something that helps keep these jobs from just disappearing as a short-term matter. A couple of particulars about how to do that. One is, don't do it as a tax credit, because if you're a tax exempt organization like a nonprofit, you won't get anything. And part of our goal should be to help the nonprofit sector grow as well as the commercial sector. On the question of direct government funding, I kind of like the idea of certainly for now having an increased payment for Corporation for Public Broadcasting. They have some history with a political firewall, but there's one thing, when you step back and think about Corporation for Public Broadcasting in the modern context, the federal government does fund nonprofit media, but it only funds nonprofit media if you have a radio license or a TV license. That used to make a lot of sense, but then this thing called the internet came along. And so now the Corporation for Public Broadcasting should really be a corporation for public media, and they should fund, yes, absolutely, public radio and public TV, but also nonprofit websites if they're nonpartisan and local, doing local reporting. So I think that should be, I like the idea of another tranche of money for CPB, but it should be partly or maybe solely for funding those other nonprofits to go along with the radio station, and also creating the model to prove out Craig's point or hope that we can have a much bigger way of funding this. Let's use this initial thing with CPB as the way of proving it can be done. Create the right formula that can be neutral and really have it be based on journalism jobs, and have it go to the right things. On the idea of deconsolidation that Craig mentioned, what we're both talking about here is that one of the problems with commercial media, with the local media now, is not even necessarily the commercial model, and it's not even necessarily only chains. It's the combination of hyper consolidation, just huge chains, plus being publicly traded companies, plus them being bought up by hedge funds and private equity funds. That triple combination is what has been devastating to journalism in communities throughout America. So we need a policy to deconsolidate, because a lot of these newspapers are still doing great work. And if we could liberate them and allow them to be replanted in communities, so potentially tax credits for allowing those things to be replanted in the community or sold to a nonprofit so that the nonprofit can take over that newspaper and really invest in it. We probably, as a companion to that, ought to have a moratorium on huge newspaper mega mergers right now. We really don't want to wake up tomorrow as we're sitting here thinking of what great public policy things we can come up with and discover that two more massive newspaper chains have merged. So we might want to do a moratorium on that. The advertising idea we talked about before, the key there is it can't just be based on reach, because then all the money will go to local TV stations and chains. And I'm not saying some of it shouldn't. Plenty of it should go to those, but it shouldn't only go there. We have to have essentially a partition so that a good chunk, I would say half, ought to go to locally owned and nonprofit media. If you did that, you would be sending hundreds of millions of dollars to the local media sector, and also creating a good precedent. So I think those are just a few ideas that that would help.
I'd like to also emphasize, I think you're right, Steve, something that Craig said earlier, that the Congressional Black Caucus, as well as the National Newspaper Publishers Association, is really pushing for, and that is that there would be funding specifically for minority-owned businesses. There are less than 200 Black newspapers in the entire country, and that's around a third of what, and they, one of our papers, 120 years old, folded last week. Well, they didn't, let me not say it that way. They temporarily stopped publishing last week. And so all of these are independent, locally owned, family owned enterprises. And so I just wanted to raise, to say what you, co-sign what you said, Craig. We have to be intentional about this. We have to be intentional about independent local media. We have to be really look into see what is really happening and how the mergers have happened and the acquisitions and the hedge funds and all of that, but actually carve out funds and programs that will support those news outlets.
Great. So next I want to ask about long-term solutions. And I know this is something that Lisa's been working on and Joaquin as well. I wonder if each of you could tell us about what's needed in the long run to preserve the unique role that local journalism plays in our society.
Sure, I'm going to start by tapping into some of the themes of the conversation that we've already covered. The first is that it's probably going to take experimentation with a wide variety of business models. This isn't about bailing out a traditional capital-intensive newspaper-based ecosystem. This is about finding alternative ways to fund it. We're also, I think I agree with what Steve and Craig and others were saying about getting more comfortable with public media, publicly supported media, and nonprofit versions of local media. That's more likely to be a bigger part of our portfolio going forward, and we'll need to get more comfortable with the kinds of implications that that has. It also means that a lot of it may take a digital form. And I also want to tap something that Craig said earlier. We at Public Knowledge are also intrigued about what the role of the digital platforms should be. I think one of our biggest learnings from the pandemic is that partnerships between the platforms and organizations that can do information analysis and cleansing has real value. It has concrete value to readers, to society, and to the platforms, particularly when the stakes on the quality of information are really high, as they have been during the pandemic. Things like national disasters or natural disasters and other situations like that. So we're looking at, is there a mechanism that can sustain and support that combination? And in doing so, create a new revenue stream for organizations that do information analysis and try to favor local journalism outlets to do that. And could that be another model that we experiment with that addresses that combination of better information quality and new revenue streams that can be for the benefit of local journalism?
I would concur. I think at the very top, we also have to, and this is something the Seattle Times, our publisher Frank Blethen's been calling for, a free press movement, where we actually organize all of our constituent parts into taking not just the long view, but being able to immediately react to the pressure that's on our free press system nationally in local communities. So we actually need to think about this as broadly as possible. And we need to think in terms of policy, the market, and local communities. One thing that we miss often is how technology helps local journalism, right? So if you think about public broadcasting, I'm support expanding the funding, and I agree with Steve's analysis, but you got almost 2,000 members of the Association of Independents in Radio. These are the freelancers. There's going to be a lot more because of where the economy is going. The whole podcasting revolution is driven by people inside and outside of traditional public media. It has created $100 million companies. There's billions of dollars in that industry now that was generated, and that's good money. That's good money being spent at the intersection of content, new producer, new voices, more diversity, right? And it's appropriate for the mobile age. So there are some near field signs of hope. Again, it's not all bad news, but I think the time pressure accelerates all of the open questions. And if we don't deal with the ownership issues, right, then we're going to quickly see this teetering, right? If you look at the Gannett share price right now, it's probably around $1. The industry is teetering right now, and there's not enough energy in the nonprofit sector to really catch up, right? So again, signs of hope. The Racial Equity Fund that was set up at Borealis with major foundations coming behind it, including Farayat Ford and others, that has identified really key hyper-local community news outlets that, again, ready for investment. So if we're going to think broadly, we need to do it in the context of a movement where we can actually have some objectives that we build over time. And I don't think that we have to lock out major technology. We actually have to figure out how to partner more effectively with them to drive down costs and increase access to innovation.
Thanks, Joaquin. So we have just a few minutes left. I want to give the panelists a chance to respond to anything that was said or any new ideas you have, and then we'll turn it over to some great audience questions. Should we just go straight to the audience questions? All right, great. So this comes from Joseph Getachew at Common Cause. He's wondering about funding to support communities that are living in news deserts. That's where there is no local news available. What kinds of ideas do you have for balancing the short-term needs of providing critical news and information for these communities, as well as the long-term needs of building sustainable models?
It's a great question, because most of the ideas we've been talking about have been ways of getting money to newsrooms that exist. So those are good policies if you exist, but if you're in a news desert where there's nothing there, it's a real problem. Now, some of what you can do is enable funds for startups. So for instance, like Report for America, we do place people into, if a community comes together and says this is a news desert, we'll put reporters there. And so you can structure public policy solutions the same way. It doesn't only have to be about helping people that are already there. Another is that if you can strengthen the existing institutions, whether they're locally based, whether they're nonprofits or for-profits, they can expand outward. They can extend into counties that don't have news coverage right now. So those are the two ways that I think news deserts are going to get filled. One is just bottom up from the community itself, and this just has to be civic leaders and community members and just residents saying this is insane, we're really hurting from not having this, pulling together a new entity and getting what is an increasing number of sources for funding. And then the other part is existing media doing what they've always done, which is expand into another area to help cover it.
Great, thanks, Steve. I think we've got time for one more question. This is from Mary S. She says, we've talked about policy support, mostly to infuse stimulus cash and public support, but are there things that journalists and news outlets can do to maybe change from their legacy operations to digital, as an example, or other things that news orgs can do?
Well, let me say,
you go ahead. Sorry, you go, Tony.
Most news organizations, if not the majority of us, we already are on the digital. We're not just doing print or not just doing radio. I mean, I can speak from the print side. We do more digital. The question that we all are trying to figure out all the time is, how do you monetize that? So if the Afro has, which we do, 700,000 followers on Facebook, how do we monetize that and really make it economically feasible to make that our core business model? And so that's one way to answer it. Someone else was getting ready to jump in.
Yeah, I was just going to say, we have had success really introducing and then developing community-funded models inside of newsrooms of all kinds of shapes and sizes. So we have a lot of best practices built up now. I mean, people on this panel have it, and I think, again, if you are on the on the audience side, reach out. I mean, this is the time for allies. So if we can accelerate and help people introduce these models, and Steve's doing a lot of that through the RFA stuff with local philanthropy, it's critical, because then that is built on the community engagement, which then turns around and helps to address trust and future sort of opportunities to really regrow the system of the local free press.
And then there are organizations like the Local Media Association. They're reaching out to local news outlets to do fundraising. It's a little foreign to us as a for-profit company, but we've jumped on it as well. And it's not limited to just the 200 or so news outlets that are participating now. So that's another way we're helping ourselves.
Yeah, I think what Tony was talking about, it really is a kind of new model that we're all going to have to be familiar with. So in the past, the answer to the question of what can the people in the community do to help journalism was buy a subscription to the newspaper or get a membership on the radio station or the website. And that's still really important. The community journalism isn't going to survive without the community. But there is this new pathway, which is kind of various hybrid models that involve donations, small donations, and people have to start thinking this way. If you're giving a donation to the library or the museum or the soup kitchen or anything else in your life that you think is critically important for the health of a community, you should be thinking about journalism too. That is what part of a healthy community is now, and we all are going to have to support it philanthropically as well as through subscriptions.
Great. Well, we are out of time. Thank you all so much, and thank you so much to our audience for watching and for your great questions. I know we have a lot of work to do ahead of us, but I'm really excited to be working with all of you. And folks, if your question didn't get asked, you should feel free to reach out to our panelists on Twitter. We have shared the Twitter handles, and we would love to continue the conversation. We are going to follow up with folks who registered on Zoom to send you the resources that we've put in the chat from our different panelists. And if you're watching on YouTube, we'll include that in the YouTube description below after the panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Alrighty.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.